Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with the full house, Patricia Murphy and Tia Mitchell. Hey, guys.
Hey, Greg. Hey, Tia.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here with both of you guys.
Yeah.
Me too.
Well, we have spent months talking about the race for governor in terms of ads, speeches, and dueling attacks, like this one.
For Keisha Lance Bottoms, politics isn't about people, it's about the perks.
The taxpayers covered the cost of a first-class plane ticket for Mayor Bottoms' husband to fly to the Super Bowl.
Who needs points with a taxpayer-funded credit card?
Atlanta taxpayers shelled out thousands.
It smells bad. What don't you get about the rules and regulations?
Rules are for the rubes and coach. With Keisha Lance Bottoms, the corruption is complimentary, just like her champagne.
But this weekend, Keisha Lance Bottoms and Rick Jackson actually came face to face in an unscripted encounter, and it got pretty tense. Outside a downtown Atlanta hotel where they both spoke at an earlier event with smartphones rolling, Bottoms confronted Jackson over attacks involving her husband.
Saying things about my husband are true. I'm fair game. Please stay away from my family.
I hear you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I like your outburst.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Less than 24 hours later, the tone changed dramatically from Rick Jackson. At a rally in Beaufort, Jackson accused Bottoms of trying to distract from questions about her record as Atlanta's mayor.
My opponent made it clear yesterday. She does not want Georgians to hear about any of this. But let me be clear. Georgians did not want to cover her husband's travel. Georgians did not want to cover her limousine rides. Georgians did not want to fund her pay-to-play scheme. And for all those reasons and more, Georgians do not want Keisha Lance Bottoms to be the next governor of Georgia.
And Governor Brian Kemp, who is attending and speaking at his first rally for Rick Jackson, he went straight at Bottoms' handling of crime protests and other crises during her time at City Hall.
Violent crime went up. Small businesses closed down, and families felt unsafe in our capital city. Law enforcement officers were scared to do their job. That's not the Georgia I know or want for my family in the future.
Let's talk about what this weekend told us about the next 70 plus or so days of the race. Patricia, no love lost between Keisha Lance Bottoms and Rick Jackson in that very awkward encounter.
But he does like her outfit.
Yeah.
That was so awkward. That was so weird. Greg, so I have been out for a bit. Let me ask you, because I believe you've done some reporting on this about the so-called pay-to-play scheme. Didn't she repay the cost of the airfare 2 weeks later? Did I miss something?
Yeah, there's a couple allegations here, a lot of them involving her first couple months as mayor. And one is, that Mayor Bottoms' husband, Derek, was part of the delegation flying to Minneapolis for the Super Bowl in 2018. And it was his airline flight. It was initially a first-class airline flight, but they ended up downgrading to another class. But it was initially bought on a city-provided credit card. So it was initially billed to the city. She ended up paying that back after she realized that. And later on, it came out in an AJC story. But that was already refunded. That's one of the allegations. There's also, a lot of attacks around $36,000 or so in ethics violations that were tallied by the State Ethics Commission. The Ethics Commission director at the time said some of them were purely procedural, some of them were not. And there's questions about basically a charter company that did chauffeured rides for her during her first couple months as mayor that exceeded the pace of Kasim Reed's mayorship. So our AJC colleague Dan Kleppel reported on that way back when in 2017, 2018. But they're, of course, resurfacing now.
Yeah, I feel like the attack on Bottoms' husband's airfare, he's a high-level executive at Home Depot. To me, this just rings a little hollow. I don't know why they would even bother with an attack like that. It doesn't feel like pay to play. I do think some of the limo charges up front were incredibly expensive. So, it's not a good look. I think the different attacks coming from Rick Jackson, the way he delivered them, and Brian Kemp, the way he delivered them, shows the gap in experience between these two gentlemen. what Brian Kemp described during COVID and the violence in the city of Atlanta was very real. Very real. And if you talk to people in Atlanta, they remember those days well when she was the mayor. And I think that is a very valid line of attack on the mayor. Other people also give her a lot of grace for that. There was a lot of violence in a lot of cities. But I think, it doesn't behoove the Jackson campaign to just throw everything against the wall and see what sticks. We're getting down to the point where you only have so much attention from voters and you only have so many attacks that are real versus just slight nonsense. There's more than enough to work with. But I think that Bottoms confronting him directly and him being very polite and almost backing down and saying, I like your outfit. That was a power move on her part. And she was like, okay, well, I'm glad we got that understood.
Tia, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Patricia. Like, that exchange made him look a little, you're not standing 10 toes down, Rick, because if before the exchange you got all these problems about her husband, then after the exchange you say, well, I still have concerns about her husband. But during the exchange, you're all like, oh, I hear you. Oh, and I like your outfit. Man, say it with your chest when you got to right face to face. You know what I mean? And I don't mean that he should have been rude, but he could have said like, I think what I've said is fair. It's not personal. It's about ethics or whatever. If you really believe it, he could have said that to her and stood in his truth. But the fact that he was like, no, I hear you, and seemed to back down made it seem like he doesn't really stand by what his ads are saying. But I feel like I get what his team is trying to do with the ads. Because at the end of the day, Rick Jackson's wealth is likely one of the biggest kind of, things that could hold people back from supporting him, that he is a billionaire. And the fact that some people might not believe he's relatable to the regular person, we know Keisha Lance Bottoms has really played up her relatability. Mm-hmm. And so I think what they're trying to do is find any examples to say, she's no different than me. Look at her spending. Look at her first class tickets. Now they know you can't really compare a billionaire to a regular heir, whatever Keisha Lance Bottoms is. They might even have, $1 million if you add everything up, but she doesn't have anywhere near the wealth that he does. But I think his team is trying to associate Keisha Lance Bottoms with the trappings of wealth to kind of negate that being a campaign issue that brings him down. Because if she's, Martha's Vineyard, wealthy and elite, just like him in voters' eyes, then maybe that can neutralize the issue. I feel that's what his team is doing.
Yeah, there's also orders of magnitude different between and she is a millionaire, but there's orders of magnitude difference between their own wealth. It's interesting too, Patricia, how we're seeing some people around Rick Jackson de-emphasize the billions of dollars he has, right? Like we get sort of emails and pushback sometimes when we call him a billionaire, even though from the outset of his campaign, Rick Jackson was the one who emphasized his great wealth. Rick Jackson was the one who could not fit his net worth on the state disclosure files. Rick Jackson was the one, trumpeting very loudly, as probably was befitting of, it was a smart move for his campaign, trumpeting the fact that he had spent this much money, $100 million plus, a $78 million ad buy, all these things that strikes fear into the hearts of his opponents.
Yes, and it's Rick Jackson and his team that wrote on the side of his campaign bus, foster care to billionaire. And that's a great life story. I think that has been what has gotten him to where he is the journey that he traveled. But I think there is deep concern now that you get to a broader electorate. Some of whom are just meeting Rick Jackson for the first time, so to speak. If you frame it foster care to billionaire, that's one story. If you frame it as billionaire healthcare executive who has $1 billion worth of contract with the state of Georgia, that's a different story. And that's the story that Democrats are trying to tell. And so by de-emphasizing his wealth, by focusing more on her and her love for the life of luxury, quote unquote, it's a way to, I think T is exactly right, to sort of neutralize the attack that's certainly coming on him. He lives in a 47,000 square foot house. Like I've never even seen, have I ever seen it? I don't even think the White House is 47,000 square feet. It's called La Rêve, which means the dream in French.
We're waiting for our invite.
I mean, it is some kind of house. It is absolutely wild. It is the most luxurious, ostentatious, over the top.
Have you seen it?
I've seen photos of it, and I've talked to people who've been there. And also the people who've been there said he's very nice. You know, they're like, oh, the guy who lives there is super nice. So, but it's just this, especially at a time when affordability is the number one issue and people are literally just trying to make ends meet. And going to the grocery store is a daily drudgery of pit in the stomach stress. Running against a healthcare executive billionaire is very rich territory for Democrats. And that's why the Republicans, I think, are de-emphasizing his wealth, trying to go back to what she's doing. And it's a different approach and a different tone from what we saw in the primary.
So Tia, there was the fallout from this awkward interaction that happened on Friday. But there was also the focus of this rally was really on Mayor Bottoms' record, because you also had Governor Kemp, delivering his remarks. You had Rick Jackson delivering much of what he said on the campaign trail before, but with some twists. You also had Chris Wright. You had John King. You had Greg Dolezal. You had other leading Republican officials all kind of reading from the same playbook, saying that Keisha Lance Bottoms' tenure in Atlanta was a disaster, in their words.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I think, was it Patricia earlier that was like, Governor Kemp is the one who had the sharper message in the clip that we played. And Governor Kemp is so good when he's campaigning with these Republicans. We saw how he kind of pulled Derek Dooley, pulled him into politics and kind of led on the campaign trail, was seen as kind of leading his campaign. And now we see Governor Kemp stepping up for Rick Jackson with a really good speech, kind of framing the Jackson-Bottoms race. What I want Governor Kemp to do is do a little tutorials behind the scenes, because we need the candidates themselves to be able to campaign with impact. Because I do think there's a risk there that, again, this perception that it's Kemp who's able to do the thing, not the actual candidate. I also think the fact that this was a big rally with everyone, and Greg, I would love to hear the Mike Collins role or lack thereof, but that it was a race with everyone. And I think they are worried about polls that shows at the top of the ticket, both with the Collins-Ossoff Senate race, and some polling even shows Bottoms ahead in the governor's race. I think the other Republicans down ticket are like, we got to do something to boost up the top of our ticket, or all of us are going to have a rough election night.
Yeah, and Mike Collins was not there. And we've also heard from Rick Jackson several times, essentially saying, hey, my focus is on my race. I'm not going to disparage Mike Collins. I'm not going to, I'm not going to diss him in any way, but he's not running for governor. I am. So, we've seen them, they've taken pictures together. We've seen them at the same events together, but they are not campaigning in tandem. He was not given a prize position in this really elaborate Rick Jackson rally that had all the things we've come to expect from a Rick Jackson rally. It was a giant event space. There were hundreds of people there. There was a line out the door to get in. There was a line out the door to get out after it ended. And there was, the sort of food we've come to expect, very fancy finger food, shrimp and bacon.
Were there tiny quiche? It looked like tiny
quiches and macarons. So my rabbi would not have been happy that that's how I spent at least a part of my Shabbos, my Saturday afternoon.
The shrimp wrapped in bacon.
I did not eat any of the shrimp wrapped bacon, Rabbi. But no, that is sort of part and parcel to the Rick Jackson event. And again, he said, look, I respect Mike. Mike is going to do his thing. I'm going to do my thing. But I'm running for governor, and I've succeeded in business with a focus on what my focus should be on, which is a focus on the governor's race. That's his line, at least.
Yeah, and I think having an quote unquote outsider message in this political environment can be very, very helpful if it's played well. And Republicans have a really unique problem on their hands in that they don't have a single incumbent on the statewide ticket. And even people who have been elected before are not particularly well known. Tim Fleming running for Secretary of State, not particularly well known. Greg Dolezal, who is a state senator running for lieutenant governor, just not really well known around this state. And so
you have to go down to John King or
Excuse me,
Tyler
John
Harper
King,
to get to the incumbents.
Okay, I guess just the big ones. Yeah. there's just not that wow factor, that loyalty factor of when Kemp is on the ballot. And when Trump is on the ballot, like, I need to get out there and vote for my guy. There's that emotional connection with those two Republicans that Republicans just do not have right now on the ticket. And that's certainly something that they can build. It's something I think Rick Jackson has created when he's met individuals. But for the most part, Georgians have not heard of him, do not know him, don't know if they trust him. And that is a lot of work to do in the next 10 weeks. And so they've got to get that enthusiasm up. And part of that is bringing Brian Kemp around, who is the most popular Republican in the state. And it's like above and beyond being popular, people like him and they trust him. And that's what they need behind this ticket.
But we've also seen Tia Kemp's struggles at transferring that popularity to other people on the ballot, not just Derek Dooley, which is the easy one, but also Kelly Loeffler. Also other people he's endorsed, including Burt Jones, just a few days before the runoff.
Yeah, I mean, I think Governor Kemp had to recover from a tough runoff night. But I think it does seem to me that he's kind of hitting his stride again, trying to help Republicans over the finish line. And I will say, like, if in November some of these Republicans running statewide are not successful, it won't be for Brian Kemp lack of trying. There are so many national factors, quite frankly, making it tough for Republicans. The economy, the fact that President Trump, Republicans in Congress are kind of unpopular right now. So it's just a tough year for Republicans, period. And the other thing is, I do think we keep talking about the lack of enthusiasm on the Republican side, but it's also contrasted with more enthusiasm on the Democratic side. Democrats we know have been activated on this issue of like voting rights. And again, there are concerns about the Trump White House. And we'll see what happens as activist groups, get out the vote groups on both sides, really start ramping up their efforts in September and going into early voting in October. But we think Democrats are going to really, really be like super revved up come election time.
Yeah, and I think that having Ossoff play out the way it's played out for him so far, he didn't get Kemp as his opponent. And then he has staged these rallies that have become kind of these national discussion points. Talking to Democrats maybe 2 years about Ossoff compared to Warnock, they're like, yeah, I like him, he's okay. Yeah, it's fine. And now like, oh, Jon Ossoff. There's a level of energy among Democrats to get out and support Ossoff that I think is going to help the entire ticket. Will they all win? I don't know. I have no idea, but it's a big shot in the arm for Democrats who need it.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about the Ossoff rally that launched 1,000 national thought pieces, and also how Mike Collins is making a play for Jewish voters angry with the senator over Israel. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy and Tia Mitchell. The reporting you hear on Politically Georgia is supported by you, our AJC subscribers. So if you're already one, thank you. But if you'd like to subscribe, head to ajc.com/start for more political coverage, analysis, newsletters, and special events. That's ajc.com/start. Now let's turn to the Senate race where Mike Collins is making an aggressive play for a group of voters Republicans don't usually win in Georgia. That's Jewish voters. And there's a reason Collins thinks he has an opening. Jon Ossoff is Georgia's first Jewish U.S. senator. His Jewish identity has been an important part of his political story and his life story from the very beginning. But his votes to block some weapons transfers to Israel have angered some Jewish leaders and voters. Some prominent figures who once celebrated Ossoff's election now accuse him of abandoning Israel at a moment of crisis. Collins is trying to capitalize. He's showing up at Jewish events. He met privately with Jewish leaders, and he's often pointed to his pro-Israel voting record. But there's an enormous complication for Mike Collins, too. His son-in-law has spread anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and white nationalist propaganda to a large social media audience, and Collins' former chief of staff pledged to help seek the release of a Holocaust denier from prison. That leaves some Jewish voters in a remarkable position, Patricia. Not since 2014, I feel like, have Jewish voters in Georgia had such a tough position. There's a lot who are voting for Ossoff. There's plenty who aren't voting for Ossoff, but many of those who are politically involved feel themselves in a bind.
Yeah, and I think Ossoff has been at loggerheads with some leaders in the Jewish community, especially at the national level. AIPAC, more than a year ago, has started sending out mailers against and emails against Jon Ossoff, saying that he had failed the Jewish community, in their opinion. At the same time, if you look at where Democrats are on Israel, especially over time, polling has shown that he's in the same place as most Democrats. And I would say the Jewish community right now appears to be split, but that is a split that Collins can and is trying to take advantage of. I had assumed when Ossoff came into office, there would be no daylight between him and the Jewish community, because when he was elected, he would tell voters, like, imagine the history you could make if you elected Georgia's first Jewish senator and Georgia's first Black senator. It was a big piece of the narrative. But I think he is fairly representative of a group of younger Jewish Americans who have deep misgivings about the war in Israel, the war against Iran, and but it certainly has not made life easy for him by taking these votes to limit some of the arms shipments to Israel, because it's become a very, very public disagreement among him and some Jewish leaders.
Yeah, his record is nuanced, right? He voted
Yeah.
in 2024 for 2 unsuccessful resolutions sponsored by Bernie Sanders that sought to block some U.S. weapons transfers to Israel. But, he's also voted for some of these weapons transfers. So it's not as easy
Right.
as just painting him as, quote unquote, anti-Israel.
Right. And I think that's something that when you talk to people who are familiar with Ossoff's camp's thinking on this, they'll say, like, if you really look at the record, he is not out of step. Kind of to Patricia's point, he is not really out of step with a lot of Democrats' thinking and a lot of Jewish people's thinking. Like, there are plenty of Jewish people who are like, I'm Jewish, I'm a proud Jewish person. I know my family and cultural ties to Israel, and I don't want to see Israel go away. But I also think the Israeli government has been a little out of pocket. And so Ossoff's camp is like, yes, there are some vocal Jewish advocates in Georgia who have been very critical of him, but they think that's a vocal minority, not really indicative of even most Jewish voters. And I think, and Greg, of course, you're in the community. Patricia, you're around Georgia. Like, I wonder how many Jewish voters are neither extreme. So how many Jewish voters are just like, I wish
Yeah.
Ossoff wouldn't, but am I going to really vote for a Republican? Probably not,
Just like any group of voters, there's plenty that aren't paying attention or who, aren't Israel first. They're not voting on this issue. I'm unusually close to this story because I'm an active member of the Jewish community. And many of our listeners know I spend at least part of every day, it feels like, at the Jewish Community Center. And I'll have people at synagogue or the JCC or you name it in the community come up to me and, why aren't you writing more about this? And some of them are pro Ossoff, some of them are against Ossoff. Clearly, though, Patricia, this has spilled over to the broader, beyond the Jewish electorate. I want to just mention that Michael Morris, he's the publisher of the Atlanta Jewish Times. He wrote an open letter in his publication accusing Ossoff of lying to Jewish Georgians when he describes his support for Israel as ironclad. And then days later, David Zalak, he is a billionaire entrepreneur in Atlanta who's given to both Jewish causes and non-Jewish causes. He wrote in a editorial in the Jerusalem Post that Ossoff has lost Georgia's Jews. Quote, Senator Jon Ossoff cannot be trusted. When the only Jewish state was fighting for its life, he broke faith, and no scorecard, no invocation of his own heritage can buy it back. So those are scathing words that are also resonating in Israel.
Yes. But it's really interesting to talk to Senator Ossoff about these votes. He believes he did the right thing. He does not regret those votes. He has said to me on multiple occasions, like, I do not believe it's in the American national interest to give any foreign country, even Israel, everything that they ask for at all times without question and without repercussions or oversight. So And I think that's what he thought those votes represented. He did vote for other arms to go to Israel. So it's very nuanced. Nuance does not play well on the campaign trail, but it is what it is. 20 years ago, these kinds of splits within the Jewish community over any vote would have been very unusual. And I have spoken with Jewish leaders who said the worst thing that could happen to Israel or the Jewish community is for Israel itself to become a wedge issue in a campaign as it is happening right now, because that means you're going to have some people with you and some people against you. And that's a very dangerous place for Israel to be when it comes to American politics. They want everyone with them. But you can certainly see Mike Collins rushing in to exploit this as a wedge issue. And there are many Jewish Republicans. I think the big takeaway from this whole thing is that this is not a monolithic vote. Younger Jewish voters can be very different from older Jewish voters. And then, of course, even you walk into any synagogue and you're going to have just a whole range of opinions, even on Israel and even on Senator Ossoff. I think the danger for Ossoff is that when you get these very high profile letters from very high ranking Jewish leaders or the publisher of the Atlanta Jewish Times, like, it feels like it represents the entire Jewish community. I don't believe it does because I've spoken with many people in the Jewish community. But it certainly is a place where Mike Collins feels he can make some traction.
And Tia, then there's the Mike Collins side of this coin, which is, of course, he's seeing this as an opening. He's trying to generate more support from Georgia's Jewish voters, but also beyond, Georgia's pro-Israel voters, which is a far bigger group than Georgia's Jewish voters. But he has his own issues. He has this extraordinary revelation that we've been reporting about and talking about over the last few weeks of his son-in-law, who has a very large social media following, distributing and amplifying anti-Semitic and white nationalist propaganda. And so a lot of the people I talked to for a story that ran a couple of days ago, they were torn about Ossoff, but they were equally torn about supporting someone like Mike Collins, given that they felt like his condemnation of his son-in-law didn't go far enough. He wasn't loud enough in that vocal opposition to what his son-in-law was saying.
And I think even more damning, Greg, just in our August 21st edition of the Politically Georgia newsletter, editor Chris Joyner, who kind of covers extremism and online edges of the internet, if you will, helped us write an item. His son-in-law still posting problematic things on the internet. Maybe not blatantly anti-Semitic things as much, but still being problematic, which, like, a month after the controversy blew up, Mike Collins wasn't able to tell his son-in-law, close the account.
Yeah.
Stop posting, period. And so I don't know if it's not just the revelations. It's like it continues to happen under Mike Collins's watch. The son-in-law, as far as we know, still lives on property he owns adjacent to his home. So it's like it's an issue that literally has not gone away, still present, still visible. And so I don't know what type of confidence that would instill in a voter saying, well, how am I to trust that Mike Collins truly finds these posts abhorrent? Or how am I to trust that Mike Collins, even what he said about, I speak for myself and no one speaks for me, and he's, going to stand up for Israel and has always stood up for Israel, I think that makes for a big hill for voters to cross.
Yeah.
My metaphors are being terrible today, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. And Patricia, before we wrap up, I mean, Mike Collins' son-in-law's name is David Allen Shearer II. His more recent comments that we dug up, and they were not hard to find. I was telling the Collins campaign, it's not like I had to go get a forensic researcher to find these things. They were right there on his social media pages. They took a different turn in one recent exchange, and this was since those revelations we've been talking about. Shearer said he, quote, absolutely believes there should be only one vote per household. After a commenter challenged him over women should have voting rights. In another, a commenter wrote that women shouldn't have free will 100%. Shearer responded, repeal the 19th Amendment. A lot of issues will resolve themselves, the 19th Amendment. guarantees women the right to vote. So that gives you an idea of the other things he's posting. Mike Collins didn't comment directly on this, but he said, hey, only I speak for myself. But clearly these are issues that continue to dog him.
Yeah, this is literally in Mike Collins' backyard, as Tia mentioned, as you both mentioned. Something that his son-in-law said last year, is this anti-Semitic? I think so. He was pointing to Benjamin Netanyahu and said, this satanic, warmongering Zionist piece of garbage. There's language from his son-in-law that when Mike Collins says, I have spoken out against anti-Semitism at every opportunity, and he has not spoken out against a statement like that and many other statements. The things about the 19th Amendment, that's just ridiculous. Like, nobody's repealing the 19th Amendment. But we're at an inflection point in American history and world history where anti-Semitism is at a dangerous, dangerous level. And it feels like it could sort of spiral out of control. And when you have an American leader at any level who does not speak out against something like this and literally hosts it on his property, it's very hard to get around that. And also hear statements, I speak out against anti-Semitism at every opportunity, and I always support the state of Israel. You can't pick your family. You can pick your neighbors if you own the property that your neighbors live on. So I think he has as many problems in this area. And Ossoff's problems come down to votes. This comes down to the company that he has surrounded himself with.
Well, we'll wrap it up right there. That's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you've got a question about Georgia politics, you can call our hotline anytime. Leave your question. We'll play it back and answer it right here on our show during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. And whether you found us on your favorite podcast app or on our new YouTube channel, thanks so much for listening to Politically Georgia. Please subscribe or follow the podcast on your favorite platform. And we always appreciate your ratings and reviews. It helps others find our show. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.